The disappearance of Tang Wei in 2008 remains one of the most efficient character assassinations in entertainment history. One moment, she was the face of a rising China, featured in Vogue, endorsed by global brands, crowned at Venice. The next, she was digitally deleted. Her face was scrubbed from billboards overnight. Her name became a sensitive keyword on the Chinese internet. This erasure was a tactical error. The censors assumed that by removing the image, they could neutralize the message. Instead, they turned an actress into a symbol of resistance. But the true trigger for this political backlash was not Tang Wei herself. She was merely the vessel for a radioactive piece of history that the state had long tried to suppress. The source of the danger was the text itself, Sei Jie. Its author, Eileen Cheung, was the literary giant of 1940s Shanghai, a woman who wrote about love not as a romance but as a form of warfare. She was cynical, cold, and brilliant, capturing the decay of the Chinese upper class with a surgical precision that made her enemies on all sides. After the communist takeover in 1949, Cheung fled, eventually dying in isolation in a cluttered apartment in Los Angeles in 1995. But she left behind a time bomb. Lust. Caution was a story she spent nearly 30 years rewriting. It was a narrative she couldn't let go of, perhaps because it was dangerously close to autobiography. It told the story of Wang Chiachi, a shy university student who joins a group of amateur resistance fighters during the Japanese occupation of Shanghai. Their plan is naive and reckless: to use a honey trap. Wang must transform herself into a seductress, infiltrate the life of Mr. Yi, a high-ranking collaborator with the Japanese secret police, and lead him to his assassination. In standard Chinese war stories, the narrative is simple. The hero sacrifices everything for the nation. The traitor is a monster. Good and evil are separated by a wall of iron. But Eileen Cheung didn't deal in walls. She dealt in fog. In her story, the hero falls in love with the monster. At the crucial moment, blinded by a sexual and emotional connection, the lust of the title, she warns him. She whispers, "Go." She saves the traitor and dooms herself and her comrades to execution. For decades, no filmmaker dared to touch it. In mainland China, the narrative of the Second Sino-Japanese War is sacred ground. The memory of the occupation, of the rape of Nanking, of the humiliation at the hands of Imperial Japan, is the foundational trauma of modern Chinese identity. To suggest that a Chinese resistance fighter could have a complex, erotic, and even loving relationship with a Han Jian, a traitor, was heresy. It was political suicide. Enter Ang Lee. In 2006, he was perhaps the only director in the world with the political capital to drink from this poison chalice. Fresh off his Oscar win, he was looking for something that would challenge him not technically, but psychologically. He wasn't interested in a war movie. He was interested in the performance of war. He wanted to explore the dark, uncomfortable gray zones of the human psyche, where patriotism bleeds into obsession and where hatred twists into desire. He needed to find a woman who could carry this burden. He needed an actress who could play a girl, playing a woman, playing a spy. He needed someone who could embody layers of deception so deep that she loses track of who she really is. The casting call went out, and it sparked a frenzy that rivals the search for Scarlett O'Hara in the West. It was the role of a lifetime. Over 10,000 actresses were screened. Every major star in China threw their hat in the ring. Zhang Ziyi, the star of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, lobbied hard for the role. She was beautiful, famous, and undeniably talented. She danced for Ang Lee. She read the lines, but Ang Lee said no. His reasoning was fascinatingly specific, and it reveals the tragedy that was to come. He felt Zhang Zi looked too clever, too fierce. When she walked into a room, you knew she could survive. The character of Wang Qiaqi needed to be tragic. She needed to look like prey walking into a lion's den, deluding herself into thinking she is the lion tamer. Then there was Shu Qi, another icon of Asian cinema. Her management read the script and saw the explicit nature of the required scenes. They saw the trap. They knew the conservative landscape of China better than anyone. They understood that while the director might be hailed as an artist, the actress who stripped naked for him would be branded a whore. They chose caution. Tang Wei would choose lust. Tang Wei was not a star. Born in 1979 in Hangzhou, a city of mist and poets, she was the daughter of a painter and a stage actress. She did not grow up posing in front of mirrors dreaming of fame. She grew up watching her mother struggle with the unglamorous reality of a performer's life, the instability, the fatigue, the low pay. She reportedly told her parents, "I will never do what you do." She wanted to be an archaeologist or perhaps a lawyer. She wanted truth, not fabrication. But destiny is a persistent hunter. In her late teens, the artistic pull became undeniable, and she set her sights on the Central Academy of Drama in Beijing. But the industry did not want her. Tang Wei failed the entrance exam for the acting department not once, not twice, but 3 times. Examiners felt she lacked the star look. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the aesthetic trend in China favored the sharp, doll-like features, the large anime eyes, the V-shaped chins. Tang Wei's face was different. It was hexagonal, slightly flat, her eyes almond-shaped but not particularly large. One examiner noted her face was too average for a lead. She didn't have the face of a modern celebrity. She had the face of a 1930s painting. It was a face that held secrets, not one that shouted for attention. Defeated but not broken, she compromised. If she couldn't be an actress, she would be a director. In 2000, she finally gained entry, but in the directing department. She spent her university years behind the scenes, studying scripts, lighting, and structure. She learned to deconstruct a scene before she ever learned to inhabit one. When Ang Lee met her, she was 27, effectively unemployed in the acting world, doing minor TV roles and modeling jobs that went nowhere. But when she walked into the audition room, wearing a simple white shirt and no makeup, Ang Lee felt a jolt of recognition. He said later, she didn't act like a modern girl. She walked slowly. She listened. Her average face, the one the Drama Academy rejected, was exactly what Lee needed. It was a blank canvas. It was a face that could disappear into a crowd, a face that could hide a knife. But the role was not given. It was earned through exhaustion. Ang Lee did not just want an actress, he wanted a resurrection. Before a single camera rolled, he sent Tang Wei to a private boot camp in Shanghai for 3 months. This wasn't just rehearsal, it was a reconstruction of a human being. Tang Wei was forbidden from wearing jeans or using a mobile phone. She was stripped of 2007. Every day she had to wear a qipao, the tight-fitting traditional dress, to learn how the high, stiff collar restricted head movement, forcing a woman to turn her entire torso to look at someone, a gesture that implies both grace and submission. She learned the Suzhou dialect, the soft musical language of the Shanghai elite. She learned how to pour tea for a superior, ensuring the spout never pointed at the guest. She learned how to walk, how to sit, how to play the pipa. She spent hours learning to play mahjong, not just the rules, but the theater of it. In the world of 1940s Shanghai wealthy wives, the mahjong table was the battlefield. It was where alliances were made, where rumors were planted, and where status was displayed. Tang Wei had to learn how to handle the tiles with a specific kind of lazy arrogance, the muscle memory of a woman who has nothing to do but gamble her husband's money. Ang Lee was molding her, layer by layer, into a weapon of seduction. Tang Wei, eager to finally prove herself after years of rejection, threw herself into the process with a frightening intensity. She cut off contact with her family. She lived in the skin of Wang Chia-chi. She didn't know it yet, but she was preparing to enter a psychological space from which she would not easily return. The physical transformation was only the surface. The internal work was far more dangerous. Ang Lee was asking her to empathize with a woman who uses her body as a tool of war. He was asking her to understand the psychology of a spy who falls in love with her rapist, with her enemy. He provided her with books about the collaborators, the men and women who worked for the Japanese, trying to make her see them not as cartoon villains, but as terrified humans trying to survive in a collapsing world. This was the core of the controversy that would later engulf her, the humanization of the traitor. By the time the crew arrived at the sound stages in Shanghai, which had been rebuilt to perfectly mimic the Nanjing Road of 1942, Tang Wei was no longer the director's student from Hangzhou. She was quiet, withdrawn, and intensely focused. And waiting for her on set was Tony Leung Chiu-wai. If Tang Wei was the novice, Tony Leung was the grandmaster. He was the soulful eyes of Wong Kar-wai's In the Mood for Love, the coolest man in Hong Kong. But for this film, he too had transformed. He had shaved his hairline to look older. He had adopted a cruel, stiff posture to play Mr. Yi, the head of the secret police. He was playing a man who tortures people for a living, a man who lives in constant fear of assassination. The chemistry between them was not instant sparks. It was a slow-burning fuse. Ang Lee kept them apart as much as possible, feeding the tension. He wanted the fear in Tang Wei's eyes to be real. He wanted the intimidation Tony Leung projected to be genuine. The stage was set for a collision. The script called for scenes of intimacy that went far beyond the standard love scenes of commercial cinema. They were described in the screenplay as violent, desperate struggles for power. The crew knew that these scenes would be the heart of the film and the heart of the darkness. As the first day of principal photography approached, a heaviness settled over the production. This wasn't going to be a fun shoot. It was going to be an exorcism. Ang Lee was known for pushing his actors to the brink of breakdown to get the truth, and he had his sights trained on Tang Wei. She was the vessel. She was the sacrifice. The lights were rigged, the 1940s costumes were pressed, and the closed set was sealed. The world outside, the Olympics preparation, the booming Chinese economy, the optimistic 21st century ceased to exist. Inside the studio, it was 1942. It was raining and the war was everywhere. The soundstage in Shanghai was no longer a place of make-believe. It had become a psychological prison. As the calendar turned to the filming of the pivotal interior sequences, the atmosphere on the set of Lust, Caution, shifted from the chaotic energy of a blockbuster production to the hushed, suffocating intensity of a religious ritual. Ang Lee, a director known for his benevolence and his fatherly demeanor, had closed the doors. The hundreds of crew members, the grips, the lighting technicians, the assistants, were dismissed. The set was cleared. What remained was a skeleton crew: the cinematographer Rodrigo Prieto, the sound recordist, the director, and the two actors. They were about to enter a tunnel from which they would not emerge for 11 days. These 11 days would become the stuff of cinema legend, whispered about in film schools and debated on internet forums for decades to come. They were the days allocated for the filming of the sex scenes. To call them sex scenes feels reductively vulgar, a disservice to the intent behind them. In the script And in Ang Lee's mind, these were not scenes of romance, nor were they titillation for the box office. They were the battlefield. In Eileen Chang's original novella, the physical relationship is alluded to, a dark undercurrent. But on screen, Ang Lee decided that the only way to make the audience understand why a resistance fighter would betray her country for a monster was to show the absolute consuming nature of their connection. It had to be primal. It had to be violent. It had to transcend language. Tang Wei, the novice, was stepping into the ring with Tony Leung, the veteran. The dynamic on set mirrored the dynamic in the script. The predator and the prey, the experienced man and the young student. But as the cameras rolled, those lines began to blur. Ang Lee treated these intimate encounters like action sequences. They were choreographed with the precision of a martial arts fight. Every gasp, every contortion, every grab was scripted and rehearsed. Yet the emotional demand was to make it look like chaotic, unbridled impulse. For Tang Wei, this was an ordeal of shattering vulnerability. She was not merely required to be nude, she was required to be emotionally flayed. The first scene they shot was the rape scene, the first encounter between Wang Chiachi and Mr. Yi. It is a scene of brutality where sex is used as a weapon of dominance and terror. There is no love in it, only power. Tang Wei had to embody the terror of a woman being crushed while simultaneously conveying the spy's steely resolve to endure it for the mission. The physical toll was immediate. Both actors were covered in sweat and bruises. The sound of flesh hitting flesh echoed in the silent studio. Between takes, the silence was heavy, oppressive. There was no joking, no small talk. Tony Leung, an actor famous for his ability to snap in and out of character, found himself unable to shake the darkness of Mr. Yi. He later described the experience as traumatic, stating that he often felt like he was having a nervous breakdown. He was playing a torturer, a man who rips fingernails out for a living, and he had to bring that energy into the bed. But it was Tang Wei who bore the brunt of the emotional weight. In one interview, she recalled that after the director yelled "cut" on a particularly harrowing take, she and Leung did not cover themselves or reach for robes. They simply collapsed into each other, weeping. It was not the weeping of lovers. It was the weeping of survivors. It was a release of the immense toxic energy they had conjured. Ang Lee, watching from the monitor, was often seen wiping tears from his own eyes. He knew what he was taking from them. He knew the cost of the truth he was demanding. The authenticity of these scenes would later become the primary weapon used against Tang Wei. The performances were so raw, the physical entanglement so graphic, that the world refused to believe it was acting. The clip incident became a focal point of obsession, a moment where viewers analyzed frame-by-frame details to prove penetration. But this obsession with the biological mechanics missed the artistic miracle. Tang Wei was not having sex. She was performing the disintegration of a soul. She was showing a woman losing herself in the darkness of her enemy. To maintain that level of intensity for 11 days, 12 hours a day, required a dissociation that is dangerous for any human psyche. By the end of the shoot, Tang Wei was hollowed out. She described walking out of the studio feeling like she had left a part of her spirit on the floor. But the physical intimacy was only one layer of the trap. The emotional climax of the film, the scene that truly seals her fate, takes place not in a bed, but in a jewelry store. It is the scene of the pigeon egg diamond ring. Late in the film, Mr. Yi takes Wang Chiachi to buy a ring. It is a moment of supreme irony. The traitor buying a symbol of eternal love for the spy sent to kill him. As the jeweler presents the massive 6-carat pink diamond, Tang Wei's performance shifts into the sublime. In this scene, there is no nudity, no violence. There is only a look. As Tony Leung gazes at her with a rare expression of tenderness and vulnerability, saying, "I want you to wear it," Tang Wei's face crumbles. In that microsecond, the spy dies, and the woman in love is born. The audience watches the realization wash over her. He loves me. This monster loves me, and I am about to kill him. It is arguably the finest piece of acting in the entire film, a masterclass in silent internal conflict. It is the moment caution is defeated by lust. When she whispers the fatal warning, "Go now," it is a suicide note, the production wrapped in a haze of exhaustion. Ang Lee, usually the pillar of strength, fell ill. He had spent months living in the dark headspace of the occupation, and he was depleted. For Tang Wei, the end of filming was disorienting. She had spent the better part of a year being someone else, living in 1942, speaking a different dialect, wearing different clothes, thinking different thoughts. Returning to 2007, to the modern world of cell phones and pop music, was a culture shock. She was no longer the girl who entered the boot camp, but she wasn't yet a star. She was in limbo. The post-production process was a race against time. Ang Lee was rushing to ready the print for the Venice Film Festival. But as the final cut began to take shape, a new battlefront emerged: the ratings board. In the United States, the Motion Picture Association of America slapped the film with an NC-17 rating, the kiss of death for commercial cinema. This rating is usually reserved for hardcore pornography or extreme violence. It meant the film could not be advertised on television, could not be played in many theater chains, and would be restricted to adults only. Usually, directors fight this. They cut frames, they obscure nudity, they soften the sounds, they beg for an R rating. But Ang Lee refused. He drew a line in the sand. He issued a statement declaring that the sex scenes were not gratuitous. They were the essential text of the film. To cut them would be to lobotomize the story. He accepted the NC-17 as a badge of honor. This decision was bold, but it had a catastrophic ripple effect. It signaled to the world, and specifically to the conservative censors in Beijing, that this was not just a movie, it was a scandal waiting to happen. Then came the premiere. Venice, September 2007. The lights went down in the Sala Grande. For 2.5 hours, the audience sat in stunned silence. They watched the lush cinematography, the immaculate period detail, and the shocking visceral intimacy. When the credits rolled, the ovation was thunderous, but it was also confused. The Western critics were awestruck by the film's bravery. The New York Times called it a film of great scary power. They praised Tang Wei's ferocious debut. But among the Asian press corps, the reaction was more complicated. They saw the political subtext that the Westerners missed. They saw the humanization of the traitor. They saw the explicit violation of traditional Chinese female modesty. They saw a woman, a Chinese daughter, laying herself bare, literally and metaphorically, for the consumption of the world. While the West saw art, the East saw a challenge to the moral order. Tang Wei, standing on that stage in her designer gown, was intoxicated by the applause. She held the Golden Lion trophy. She was the Cinderella of the festival. She smiled for the cameras, unaware that the photos being taken were already circulating on the nascent social media platforms of China, sparking a firestorm of debate. Is this art or is this porn? Is she a brave actress or a shameless woman? Why is she glorifying a traitor? The film was set to release in China in November. The stakes were incredibly high. Ang Lee, understanding the rigidity of the Chinese censorship system, personally oversaw a re-edit of the film for the mainland market. He voluntarily cut 7 minutes of footage, the entirety of the explicit sex scenes. He hoped that by removing the offensive visual content, he could save the film's soul and allow it to be seen by his countrymen. He wanted the dialogue, the history, and the tragedy to survive. When Lust Caution finally opened in Beijing and Shanghai, it was a cultural phenomenon. Cinemas were packed. Scalpers sold tickets for 5 times their face value. It was the movie everyone had to see. But the version they saw was sanitized. The lust was gone, leaving only the caution. Viewers in China watched a disjointed narrative, where the character's intense psychological bond seemed to materialize out of nowhere, because the physical crucible that forged it had been excised. Yet, even in its censored form, the film was dangerous. The patriotic youth, angry nationalistic netizens, began to mobilize online. They weren't just angry about the sex, they were angry about the history. They accused the film of beautifying traitors. They accused Ang Lee of insulting the martyrs of the resistance. And because they couldn't attack the revered Ang Lee, and they couldn't touch the untouchable Tony Leung, they turned their sights on the softest target. Tang Wei was everywhere. She was on the cover of LA, Vogue, and Marie Claire. She was the face upon skincare, her flawless porcelain skin beaming from television sets across the nation. She was winning Best Newcomer awards left and right. She was the it girl of 2008. But the higher she rose, the more exposed she became. The disconnect between her wholesome, elegant public image and the raw, shameful character she played on screen began to create a cognitive dissonance in the conservative establishment. The whispers in the corridors of power began to grow louder. Bureaucrats at SAR-FT were getting nervous. The year 2008 was approaching, the year of the Beijing Olympics. The Communist Party wanted to present a unified, harmonious, and morally pure face to the world. They wanted stories of heroism, of sacrifice, of national glory. They did not want a story about a girl who unzips the pants of a traitor and falls in love with him. They did not want a star whose fame was built on lewdness. Tang Wei continued her press tour, traveling to Taiwan, to Hong Kong, to the U.S. She gave interviews in halting English, charming the likes of Charlie Rose. She spoke of her dedication to art, of her respect for Ang Lee. She was playing the role of the international ambassador for Chinese cinema perfectly. She didn't feel the ground shifting beneath her feet. She didn't see the memos being drafted in Beijing. She didn't know that her very success was writing her death warrant. The storm clouds were gathering, heavy and black. The kill order was not yet signed, but the pen was hovering over the paper. The tragedy of Tang Wei is that she did everything right. She gave the performance of a lifetime. She served the vision of a master director. She sacrificed her modesty for the sake of truth. And for that, she was about to be destroyed. The curtain was coming down on the first act of her life, and the darkness that followed would be absolute. But beneath the surface, the tectonic plates were shifting. The success of Lust Caution had created a paradox. The government had allowed the sanitized version of the film to screen, assuming the cuts would neutralize its danger. They were wrong. The film had taken on a life of its own, in private dinners, in university dorms, and on internet message boards. The conversation was not about the film's artistic merit, but about its morality. The Fenqing nationalists were growing louder. They viewed the character of Wang Cheqi not as a tragic victim of war, but as a woman who had betrayed her country for an orgasm. They argued that Tang Wei, by humanizing such a character, was complicit in tarnishing the dignity of the Chinese people. Then a separate spark ignited the powder keg. In February 2008, the Edison Chen photo scandal exploded in Hong Kong. Hundreds of private, explicit photographs of famous Hong Kong stars were leaked online. It was a moral panic of epic proportions. While unconnected to Tang Wei, it created a hysterical atmosphere regarding moral decay in the entertainment sector. The authorities, terrified that this wave of vulgarity would spoil the pristine image of the Olympic year, decided a purge was necessary. They needed to send a message. They needed a scapegoat. Edison Chen was a Hong Konger largely outside their direct control. But Tang Wei? She was a mainlander. She was right there. The axe fell in early March 2008. It did not come with a bang, but with a bureaucratic whisper. There was no press conference, no judge, no jury. It was an internal directive known in the Chinese system as Neibu, issued by the State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television. The order was orally transmitted to television stations and advertising agencies. The directive was terrifyingly simple. Cease all promotion of Tang Wei. The speed of the erasure was Orwellian. One day, Tang Wei was the face of pawns, her smile greeting millions of commuters. The next day, she was gone. The commercials were pulled from the airwaves instantly. Billboards were taken down overnight, leaving blank spaces on the city skyline. A scheduled interview with a major fashion magazine was canceled without explanation. The organizers of the Asian Film Awards were quietly told that Tang Wei was inconvenient. The official reasoning, when finally teased out of tight-lipped officials by courageous reporters, was vague and puritanical. They cited the sexual nature of her performance. They claimed her behavior in the film glorified traitors and insulted the martyrs. SARFT released a guideline stating a ban on content that showed promiscuous acts, rape, prostitution, and sexual perversion. Tang Wei was retroactively categorized as pornographic, but this explanation crumbled under the slightest scrutiny. If the film was pornographic, why was it approved for release in cinemas just months prior? If the content was illegal, why was the director, Ang Lee, not punished? This is where the story of Tang Wei shifts from a showbiz scandal to a tragedy of gender politics. The disparity in treatment between the cast and crew of Lust, Caution remains one of the most glaring examples of sexism in modern Chinese cultural history. Let us look at the roster. Ang Lee, the architect of the pornography, the man who insisted on the sex scenes, the man who directed every moan and thrust, was untouched. In fact, he was celebrated. He was chosen to be an artistic advisor for the Beijing Olympics opening ceremony, the ultimate state honor. To the authorities, Ang Lee was a great master, a global asset who brought prestige to the Chinese nation. He was too big to fail. Tony Leung, the male lead who participated in the exact same sexual acts, whose nudity was also captured on film, and whose character was the actual traitor and murderer, faced zero repercussions. He continued to film Red Cliff, a massive state-sanctioned historical epic. He appeared on television. He remained the emperor of cinema. The public narrative forgave him instantly. He was just doing his job. He was an actor playing a role. But Tang Wei? She was not afforded the luxury of being an actor. She was viewed as the temptress. In the deeply conservative, patriarchal undercurrent of Chinese society, the woman bears the burden of sexual morality. By performing those scenes, Tang Wei was seen as having given up her virtue. She was no longer a professional. She was spoiled goods. The ban was not just censorship, it was a public shaming. It was a modern-day witch trial masked as administrative regulation. The cruelty of the ban lay in its totality. It wasn't just that she couldn't make movies, she couldn't make a living. The pawn's contract, worth a reported 6 million yuan, was terminated. Under the force majeure clauses of advertising contracts, the ban allowed the company to drop her without compensation. She was radioactive. Directors who had been clamoring to work with her suddenly stopped returning her calls. To cast Tang Wei was to invite the wrath of the censors. No investor would risk millions of dollars on a film that might never be released because the lead actress was on a blacklist. Tang Wei found herself in a vacuum. She was 28 years old, the most famous actress in Asia, and she was unemployable. The psychological toll of this sudden isolation is hard to overstate. Imagine reaching the summit of Everest, only to be pushed off the edge by the very Sherpas who guided you there. The reaction from the intellectual community was one of shock and anger. Feng Xiaogang, one of China's most commercially successful directors, famously spoke out later, questioning the logic of the ban. If you want to ban someone, he argued, you should ban the producer or the director. Why ban the actress? She is just a little girl who listened to the director. It's bullying. But these voices were drowned out by the noise of the approaching Olympics. The state machine did not care about fairness. It cared about spiritual pollution. Tang Wei was a stain that needed to be bleached. During those dark months in the spring of 2008, Tang Wei retreated into silence. The paparazzi hunted her, desperate for a photo of the fallen star crying, drinking, or falling apart. They wanted the narrative of the tragic breakdown. They wanted her to be Ruan Ling Yu, the 1930s silent film star who committed suicide under the pressure of gossip. But Tang Wei denied them that satisfaction. She stayed home. She read books. She refused to give interviews where she might be tempted to criticize the government or her co-stars. Her silence was not an admission of guilt. It was a fortress of dignity. She understood something profound. In a system where speech is controlled, the only freedom left is the freedom to say nothing. However, the silence of the room was deafening. The phone, which had rung incessantly for 6 months, was now dead. Friends in the industry drifted away, fearful of guilt by association. She was experiencing the social death that serves as the ultimate punishment in a collectivist society. She was present, but invisible. It was during this period of forced stagnation that a realization began to dawn on her. She could not stay in Beijing. Beijing was a city of power, and she was powerless. Every street corner reminded her of the billboards that were no longer there. Every news report about the Olympics was a reminder of the party she was uninvited from. Staying meant withering. Staying meant accepting the label of the banned actress. She needed to escape, not to run away, but to find a place where she could breathe, where her identity wasn't defined by 7 minutes of film footage. She needed a place where nobody cared about the politics of the Chinese Communist Party. Rumors began to circulate that she was looking abroad. Some said she was going to America. Others said she was quitting acting entirely to get married. But Tang Wei was plotting a different course. She looked at her bank account, drained by the loss of endorsements and the lack of work. She looked at her skill set. She was a director by training, an actress by trade, but she spoke only rudimentary English. She saw the ban not as a stop sign, but as a detour. If China wouldn't let her work, she would learn. If they tried to erase her, she would make herself indelible. She began to pack her bags. She wasn't packing for a vacation. She was packing for a metamorphosis. She set her sights on London, a gray, rainy city far from the humid oppression of the Shanghai studios and the cold judgment of Beijing. But before she left, there was one final indignity. The Hong Kong Film Awards were approaching in April 2008. Lust, Caution was nominated for everything. Tang Wei was nominated for Best Actress. In a normal world, she would be the belle of the ball, but the broadcast rights for the ceremony in mainland China were held by state TV. The directive was still in effect. On the night of the ceremony, Tang Wei appeared. She wore a simple, elegant dress. She smiled. She presented an award. But on the mainland broadcast, delayed by a few seconds to allow for censorship, she was a ghost. When the camera panned to her, the feed cut away. When her name was mentioned, the audio dipped. Millions of Chinese viewers watched the ceremony, but they never saw her. It was a digital erasure, a real-time editing of reality. She was there, in flesh and blood, yet on the screens of her homeland, she did not exist. This was the bottom. This was the moment the cage fully closed. The golden lion had become a cage of iron. The kill order was complete. The girl from Hangzhou had been successfully deleted from the national consciousness. Or so they thought. As the plane lifted off from Beijing Capital International Airport, heading west, Tang Wei looked down at the city that had rejected her. She was leaving as a pariah. She had no idea that she was embarking on a journey that would turn her into a legend. The ban, intended to destroy her, was about to become the fire that forged her. The actress was dead. The survivor was about to be born. The flight from Beijing to London is a journey of nearly 10 hours, spanning 5,000 miles in 7 time zones. For most passengers on that flight in late 2008, it was a commute between 2 global capitals. For Tang Wei, it was a traversal between 2 distinct realities. Behind her lay a country that had simultaneously crowned her and condemned her, a place where her face was both an icon of beauty and a symbol of shame. Ahead of her lay the unknown. When the wheels of the plane touched down on the wet tarmac of Heathrow Airport, the gray English sky offered a stark contrast to the celebratory crimson that had engulfed Beijing during the Olympic summer. She walked through customs not as a movie star, but as a ghost. There were no flashing cameras, no screaming fans, no handlers to rush her through a VIP exit. The immigration officer stamping her passport saw only a 29-year-old student from Hangzhou, looking perhaps a little tired, clutching a letter of acceptance from a university. This anonymity, terrifying to those addicted to fame, was for Tang Wei a sudden, violent liberation. For the first time in 2 years, the gaze of the public was broken. The kill order from the State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television could not reach her here. The whispers about her morality, the debates about her body, the political fury of the nationalists, it all dissolved in the cold, damp air of the United Kingdom. She took a cab not to a luxury hotel, but to a modest rental. She was swapping the red carpet for the rainy pavement, the designer gowns for heavy wool coats. It was the beginning of a self-imposed exile that would become the most mythologized period of her life. In the vacuum of information left by her departure, the Chinese internet began to dream. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the celebrity gossip machine abhors silence. Without fresh photos or interviews, the public imagination began to fill in the blanks, crafting a narrative that was part Dickensian tragedy, part inspirational fable. A story began to circulate on social media platforms and forums like Tianya and Weibo, growing in detail with every repost. It was titled "My Days Selling Corn in London." This viral article, written in the first person as if by Tang Wei herself, painted a vivid, almost cinematic picture of a fallen star scrapping for survival in a foreign land. The story claimed that Tang Wei, cut off from her income and blacklisted by advertisers, had arrived in London destitute. It described her calculating the cost of every meal, realizing that her savings from her commercial work were insufficient to cover the exorbitant tuition and living costs in the UK. The narrative detailed how she allegedly turned to street vending to survive. It claimed she set up a stall to sell Hui-style grilled corn, using a family recipe to charm the British palate. It went further, describing how she acted as a street model, doing face painting for tourists at Piccadilly Circus, and even hustling locals in badminton matches, charging £1 per game and using her skills as a former junior athlete to win grocery money. The story was compelling because it fit a specific cultural archetype, the resilient, suffering woman who retains her dignity in poverty. It turned the shameful actress into a working-class hero, a woman who rolled up her sleeves and refused to be broken. Millions of people read it. They shared it. They praised her indomitable spirit. It became a defining piece of her lore. But it was a lie. The truth of Tang Wei's exile was less dramatic, but far more profound. She was not selling corn on the street corners of London. She was not hustling badminton games for coins. The viral article was a fabrication, likely written by a content farm or an imaginative fan, capitalizing on the mystery of her disappearance. However, the reality of her life in the UK was indeed a struggle, though of a different kind. It was an intellectual and psychological struggle. She had enrolled at the University of Reading, a respected institution located in a quiet town west of London. It was far removed from the glitz of the West End. She was there to study drama, but her primary obstacle was language. Tang Wei arrived in England with a vocabulary that was largely functional, nowhere near the fluency required to study theater at a collegiate level. She later described the humiliation of those early days, the feeling of reverting to childhood. In Beijing, she was an articulate, intelligent woman who had held her own against the press. In Reading, she was the quiet foreign student in the back of the room, terrified to speak for fear of making a mistake. She attacked the English language with the same ferocious intensity she had applied to her role in Lust, Caution. If Ang Lee's boot camp had broken her body to build a spy, London broke her ego to build an artist. She carried a dictaphone everywhere, recording her professors, her classmates, even conversations on the bus. She spent her evenings replaying the tapes, mimicking the cadence, the rhythm, the specific musicality of British English. She wasn't just learning grammar. She was learning a new way to present herself to the world. She read Shakespeare, stumbling over the archaic phrasing, forcing her mouth to form shapes that felt alien. Financially, while she was not destitute, the situation was precarious. The ban had severed her endorsement deals, the lifeblood of any modern star's income. The millions of yuan from the pawn's contract had evaporated. She was living on savings, supported quietly by her agency and by Bill Kong, the legendary producer of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, who had taken her under his wing. Kong and Ang Lee felt a deep paternal responsibility for her. They knew that the system had treated her unjustly, and they were determined to ensure she didn't starve, metaphorically or literally. But they also knew that they couldn't just give her money. They had to give her a future. And that future required her to grow beyond the boundaries of the Chinese film industry. During these 2 years, roughly from 2008 to 2010, Tang Wei lived a life of deliberate solitude. She attended plays in London's West End, watching giants of the stage like Judi Dench and Helen Mirren. She observed how these women commanded attention not through sexuality but through presence. She saw that in the West, an actress could age, could be complex, could be something other than a decorative vase. This was a revelation. In the hyper-commercialized, youth-obsessed market of China, an actress's value often depreciated the moment she turned 30. In the dark theaters of London, Tang Wei realized that her career didn't have to end because of a scandal. It was just changing shape. She learned to cook for herself. She took the tube. She walked in the parks, watching the seasons change from the verdant green of English summer to the damp, bone-chilling gray of winter. This period allowed her to shed the skin of Wang Qiaqi. For years, she had been possessed by that character, the trauma, the fear, the sexuality. London was the exorcism. The anonymity allowed her to rediscover who Tang Wei was when she wasn't being watched. She found that she was tougher than she thought. She found that she could be happy without applause. While she was rebuilding her internal world, her allies were maneuvering to secure her external safety. Bill Kong knew that Tang Wei could not simply waltz back into Beijing. The ban was still in effect, an invisible wall blocking her return. They needed a loophole. They found it in the quality migrant admission scheme of Hong Kong. Hong Kong, under the one country, two systems policy, maintained its own immigration and censorship laws. It had a robust independent film industry that had always welcomed talent from the mainland. By applying for Hong Kong residency, Tang Wei could technically rebrand herself. She would no longer be just a banned mainland actress. She would be a Hong Kong resident. This distinction was subtle, legalistic, but crucial. It allowed mainland producers to hire her under the co-production treaties, bypassing the direct oversight of the mainland censorship bodies that had blacklisted her. In late 2008, her application was approved. It was a quiet victory, a bureaucratic checkmate against the system that tried to erase her. She now had a passport to freedom, a base of operations that was Chinese in culture but international in law. But a visa is not a job. She still needed a role that would justify her return. She needed a script that was powerful enough to make people forget the scandal, but safe enough to avoid triggering another one. That script did not come from China. It did not come from Hong Kong. It came from South Korea. In 2009, as Tang Wei was finishing her studies, a package arrived. It contained the screenplay for Late Autumn, a remake of a beloved 1966 Korean classic. The film was being helmed by Kim Tae-yong, a director known for his sensitive, atmospheric storytelling. He was looking for an actress to play Anna, a woman imprisoned for murdering her abusive husband, who was granted a brief 72-hour parole to attend her mother's funeral in Seattle. Kim Tae-yong had seen lust, caution. Like the rest of the world, he had been mesmerized. But unlike the censors, he wasn't fixated on the nudity. He was fixated on the silence. He saw in Tang Wei's performance a capacity for profound, unspoken grief. He saw a woman who could convey a lifetime of suffering with a single glance. He knew she was Anna. There was, however, a significant challenge. Tang Wei did not speak Korean. The male lead, Hyun Bin, one of South Korea's biggest heartthrobs, did not speak Chinese. The solution was written into the script. The characters would communicate in English, the clumsy, halting lingua franca of two lost souls meeting in a foreign land. The irony was poetic. The English language, which she had struggled with in the classrooms of Reading, the language that had made her feel like a fool, was now the key to her salvation. It was the bridge that would carry her out of exile. She accepted the role. Leaving London was bittersweet. The city had been her sanctuary. It had hidden her when she needed to be invisible. It had taught her that life continues even when the world turns its back on you. She packed her bags, not to return to the chaotic celebrity culture of Beijing, but to fly to the foggy, rain-swept streets of Seattle, where Late Autumn was to be filmed. She was stepping back onto a movie set, but the dynamic had shifted. She was no longer the rookie being molded by a dictator director. She was a woman who had survived a political firestorm. She carried with her a new gravity. When she met Kim Tae-yong and Hyun Bin, she was quiet, professional, and intensely focused. She was about to channel all the loneliness of her London exile, all the pain of the public shaming, and all the resilience of her silence into the character of Anna. The character was a prisoner on temporary release. Tang Wei, in a very real sense, was exactly the same. She was stepping out of the prison of the ban, testing the air, unsure if she would be allowed to remain free. The film Late Autumn would not be a blockbuster action movie or a scandalous erotic thriller. It would be a quiet, melancholic poem about finding connection in the midst of despair. And for Tang Wei, it would be the first step of a resurrection that no one in China had believed was possible. The girl who sold corn in the myths of the internet was gone. The woman who would conquer a new country was about to take the stage. Arriving in the misty landscape of the Pacific Northwest, Tang Wei didn't just step onto a set. She stepped into a mirror. The character of Anna, a prisoner granted a brief 72-hour furlough, paralleled her own reality so starkly it was painful. She too was on a temporary release, testing the air of freedom, carrying the invisible chains of her ban in China. From the first day of pre-production, director Kim Tae-yong made a bold aesthetic choice that would define the film's visual language. He stripped Tang Wei of her glamour. In lust, caution, she had been a shapeshifter, a weapon of seduction painted in crimson lipstick and clad in silk chapeaus that accentuated every curve. She had been the object of the male gaze, a femme fatale designed to destroy. In Late Autumn, Kim Tae-yong went in the opposite direction. He put her in a beige trench coat that seemed slightly too large, as if she were shrinking inside it. He mandated that she wear almost no makeup. Her hair was tied back in a messy, careless knot, with loose strands falling across a face that looked pale, tired, and utterly defeated. This stripping away of artifice was a significant risk. In the commercial entertainment industries of Asia, particularly in China and Korea, actresses are often treated as porcelain dolls. Their value is frequently tied to a pristine, ageless perfection. To appear on screen looking exhausted with dark circles under the eyes and dry skin was an act of defiance. It was a rejection of the star image. But Tang Wei understood that Anna's beauty had to come from her damage, not her decoration. She leaned into this anti-glamour. She wanted the audience to look at her and see the exhaustion of the soul. She wanted them to see a woman who had forgotten how to be a woman, who had become merely a number in a penal system. The production was a linguistic high-wire act, adding another layer of complexity to the performance. The film was a transnational co-production, featuring a Chinese actress and a South Korean leading man, the superstar Hyun Bin. In the narrative, their characters are strangers who meet by chance on a bus to Seattle. Hyun Bin plays Hoon, a gigolo on the run from a client's angry husband. He's a man who sells his charm, a hustler who uses words as currency. Anna, by contrast, has forgotten how to speak. Because they come from different worlds, they are forced to communicate in English, the clumsy, halting, tentative lingua franca of two immigrants adrift in America. For Tang Wei, this was where her years of struggle in the classrooms of the UK paid dividends. But she wasn't asked to speak the polished Shakespearean English she had practiced in London. She had to unlearn her lessons. She had to speak the English of Anna, a language of hesitation, of broken grammar, of words that get stuck in the throat. Acting in a second or third language is a notorious trap for performers. The mental effort required to remember phonetics often kills the emotion in the eyes. The actor becomes a reciter of lines rather than a vessel of feeling. But Tang Wei turned this barrier into a bridge. Because she couldn't rely on rapid-fire dialogue to express herself, she channeled everything into her silence. The performance she delivered in Late Autumn is a masterclass in minimalism. There are long stretches of the film where she says nothing at all. She simply walks through the fog-drenched Pike Place market, hands deep in the pockets of her trench coat, head down, watching the happy families and the tourists with a mixture of envy and alienation. Yet in that silence, she screams. Viewers could feel the weight of the kill order, the loneliness of the London nights, the injustice of her treatment by the Chinese state. She poured every ounce of her personal suffering into the vessel of Anna. When Anna looks at the world with a mix of wonder and terror, it is Tang Wei looking at her own career, wondering if this freedom is real or just an illusion that will vanish when the clock runs out. Her co-star Hyun Bin played the perfect foil. Hoon is all surface, all noise, a man trying to crack open Anna's shell with jokes and borrowed watches. The chemistry between them is unlike the violent, carnal heat of lust, caution. It is a slow burn. It is a connection forged in the cold, damp air. It is the warmth of two people huddled together against a storm. There is a specific scene in the film that captures this dynamic perfectly. They are sitting in an empty amusement park watching the fog roll in. They are not touching, they are barely speaking. But the air between them vibrates with a shared understanding of what it means to be alone. It was a romance of the outcast. Guiding this delicate dance was Kim Tae-yong. If Ang Lee had been the stern, demanding patriarch who pushed her to the brink of a breakdown to extract the truth, Kim Tae-yong was the gentle partner who held her hand. The atmosphere on the set was one of quiet respect and intellectual collaboration. Kim didn't want to break her. He wanted to heal her. He saw the fragility in her, and he treated it with reverence. He later said in interviews that filming Tang Wei was like filming the weather in Seattle. She was unpredictable, moody, capable of shifting from sunshine to storm in a single take, and completely mesmerizing. A profound bond was forming between director and actress, a professional respect that would, years later, blossom into a real-life marriage. But in the winter of 2009, it was strictly about the work. It was about proving that she was still alive. When Late Autumn premiered in 2010 at the Toronto International Film Festival and subsequently released in South Korea in early 2011, the reaction was not instantaneous, but it was deep. It was not a Marvel blockbuster. It was a slow, meditative art house film. But in South Korea, it struck a nerve that resonated across the entire culture. The Korean audience, known for their deep appreciation of melodrama and emotional complexity, the concept of Han, or deep-seated sorrow, completely surrendered to Tang Wei. They didn't see the banned actress of China. They didn't care about the politics of the Communist Party or the moral judgments of the Sarft. They saw a woman of exquisite grace. They fell in love with her aura, a term often used in Korean media to describe a star's intangible presence. They called her the goddess of atmosphere. She possessed a melancholic elegance that stood in stark contrast to the hyper-polished, surgically enhanced aesthetic that dominated K-pop and Korean television at the time. Tang Wei felt real. She felt like a character from a novel, stepping off the page. The film became a cultural phenomenon in Korea. It became the highest-grossing Korean film released in China at the time, a delicious irony given her status there. The Chinese public, starved of her presence, flocked to see the movie, effectively bypassing their government's attempt to erase her. But the true vindication, the moment that signaled the failure of the ban, came on the night of May 26, 2011, at the 47th Baeksang Arts Awards. The Baeksang Arts Awards are the Golden Globes of South Korea, the highest honor in the country's film and television industry. Historically, these awards are insular, almost exclusively reserved for Korean talent. The Korean entertainment industry is fiercely proud and protective of its own. For a foreigner to be nominated is rare. For a foreigner to win Best Actress is unprecedented. It was a closed shop, a glass ceiling that no one expected to be broken. But that night, the impossible happened. As the presenter opened the envelope, a hush fell over the Grand Peace Palace in Seoul. When he read the name, Tang Wei. The auditorium erupted. Tang Wei, wearing a stunning gown that seemed to wipe away the beige trench coat of Anna, walked to the stage in genuine shock. She was the first foreign actress in the history of the awards to take home the Best Actress trophy. She stood at the podium holding the heavy statue, looking out at a sea of faces that were not her countrymen, yet who had embraced her more fully than her homeland had. She spoke in a mixture of English and Chinese, thanking the Korean people for their acceptance. It was a moment of supreme validation. Across the Yellow Sea in Beijing, she was still technically a persona non grata, a woman whose name was whispered in corridors. But here in Seoul, she was a queen. She had conquered a foreign land not with a sword, but with silence. This victory changed the geopolitical landscape of her career. It shifted the power dynamic entirely. The Chinese authorities could ban her domestically, but they could not ignore her global ascent. By embracing her, South Korea had effectively shamed the Chinese censors. They had recognized and celebrated the talent that Beijing had thrown in the trash. The kill order was beginning to look petty, vindictive, and ineffective against the sheer force of her international acclaim. Tang Wei had found a new home. She had bypassed the blockade by simply going around it. She proved that art does not need a passport, and talent does not need permission from a government bureau to exist. She had been exiled to the wilderness, but in that wilderness she had built a kingdom. The success of Late Autumn did more than just restore her career. It restored her confidence. She realized that she was not defined by one scandalous role. She was capable of reinvention. The film also opened the door to the Korean market, leading to endorsement deals and magazine covers in Seoul. She became the face of Samsung, of Kolon Sport, replacing local stars. She was no longer that actress from the sex movie. She was Tang Wei, the international star. As she walked off the Baeksang stage, the applause ringing in her ears, the ghost of Wang Chiachi finally began to fade. The spy who died for love was part of her history, but she was no longer her destiny. Tang Wei had survived the winter. The ice was breaking. But as the snow melted, a new path was revealing itself, one that would eventually lead her back to the very dragon that had tried to devour her. The ban was eroding, not because the officials had a change of heart, but because she had become too big to hide. The next chapter would not be about escape. It would be about return. She was ready to go home, but she would return on her own terms. The trophy Tang Wei held in her hands in Seoul was made of gold, but its true value was iron. It was a shield. The Baeksang Award had fundamentally altered the geopolitical calculus of her career. By being crowned the queen of the Korean screen, she had made it politically embarrassing for the Chinese entertainment industry to continue ignoring her. She had become an international asset, a cultural export that was thriving in a foreign market. In the face of this undeniable success, the kill order in Beijing began to lose its teeth. It was not rescinded with a formal apology or a red-stamped document. Authoritarian systems rarely admit mistakes. Instead, the ban simply evaporated into the gray mist of bureaucracy. The phones that had been silent for 3 years began to ring again. The unwritten rule that Tang Wei was radioactive was quietly replaced by a new pragmatic understanding. She was bankable. However, the path back to the mainland was treacherous. Tang Wei knew that one misstep could reactivate the censor's wrath. She could not return as a seductress. She could not play a character that challenged the moral order or touched upon political sensitivities. She needed a role that was grounded, humble, and unthreatening. She needed to remind the Chinese public that she was not a traitor or a symbol of lust, but a daughter of the soil. Her first major step back into the Chinese spotlight came in 2011 with the martial arts epic Dragon, directed by Peter Chan. The film was a Hong Kong mainland co-production, a safe harbor, but the role Tang Wei chose was a strategic masterstroke. She played Ayu, the long-suffering rustic wife of a repentant killer hiding in a remote village in Yunnan province. To prepare for this role, Tang Wei once again engaged in her signature method of total immersion, but this time the direction was not toward elegance, but toward earthiness. She traveled to the filming location in the damp, verdant valleys of Tangchong. She cast aside the chipaos of Shanghai and the trench coats of Seattle. She put mud under her fingernails. She learned to walk not with the grace of a spy, but with the heavy, planted gait of a woman who carries water buckets up a mountain every day. In Dragon, Tang Wei is almost unrecognizable. Her skin is darkened to mimic years of sun exposure. Her clothes are rough cotton. She plays a mother trying to protect her family from a violent past. It was a performance of quiet dignity. By playing a peasant wife, the archetype of traditional Chinese virtue, she was subconsciously signaling to the audience and the authorities, "I am one of you. I am not a threat." The film was a critical success, premiered at Cannes, and saw a wide release in China. When her face appeared on the big screen in Beijing for the first time since 2007, the theaters did not burn down. The protests did not materialize. The Fenqing nationalists stayed home. The exorcism was working, but survival was not enough. Tang Wei wanted to thrive. She had proven she could do tragedy, she had proven she could do melancholy, and she had proven she could do stoic drama. But the industry still viewed her as a heavy actress, a woman synonymous with tears and trauma. To truly reclaim her position as a top-tier star, she needed to do something she had never done before. She needed to make people laugh. In 2012, a script landed on her desk titled Beijing Meets Seattle. It was a romantic comedy. The premise was risky. Tang Wei would play Jia Jia, the mistress of a wealthy, corrupt Beijing tycoon. She travels to Seattle to give birth in a clandestine maternity center to secure American citizenship for her child, while spending her boyfriend's illicit money on luxury handbags. On paper, the character was a disaster waiting to happen. In a society grappling with the wealth gap and corruption, playing a materialistic mistress could have easily reignited the public's animosity toward her. It danced dangerously close to the very accusations of moral corruption that had gotten her banned in the first place. But Tang Wei saw something else in the script. She saw a redemption arc, and she saw the guiding hand of a female director, Xue Xiaolu. Director Xue Xiaolu was not interested in vilifying the mistress. She was interested in humanizing her. She wanted to explore the emptiness of materialism and the journey toward independence. Tang Wei accepted the role, and in doing so she returned to Seattle, the city that had sheltered her during her exile in late autumn. But this was a different Seattle. If late autumn was the Seattle of fog and ghosts, Finding Mr. Right was the Seattle of sunlight, space needles, and screwball comedy. The transformation was startling. Tang Wei, known for her reserve and her intellectual aura, exploded onto the screen as a brash, loud, shopaholic diva. She wore garish designer clothes, screamed at drivers, threw credit cards around, and spoke with a rapid-fire Beijing attitude. It was a performance of high energy and charisma. For the first act of the film, she is insufferable. But as the story progresses and her tycoon boyfriend is arrested back in China, stripping her of her wealth, Tang Wei peels back the layers. She shows the terror of a woman who has relied on men for everything and is suddenly alone in a foreign land. Her chemistry with the male lead, Wu Shubo, was electric. It was the classic odd couple dynamic. But it was Tang Wei's comedic timing that shocked the critics. She was funny, she was warm, she was lovable. She took a character that should have been hated, a gold digger, and turned her into a symbol of resilience. The audience watched her scrub toilets, sell bags on the street, and eventually find her own strength. When Finding Mr. Right was released in March 2013, the reaction was seismic. It didn't just perform well, it shattered records. It became one of the highest-grossing domestic romantic comedies in Chinese history, taking in over 500 million yuan. It beat Hollywood blockbusters. It became a cultural touchstone. The success of Finding Mr. Right was the final nail in the coffin of the ban. You cannot ban a woman who generates 500 million yuan at the box office. Money, in the end, is the most powerful censor. The industry that had shunned her now rushed to embrace her. The advertisers who had torn up her contracts came crawling back. But this time, they weren't buying the controversial Tang Wei. They were buying the national sweetheart. The irony was profound. Tang Wei had been banned for playing a woman who uses sex to serve her country, but she was redeemed by playing a woman who uses money to serve herself. It said as much about the changing values of modern China as it did about her acting. The China of 2013 was a different beast than the China of 2007. It was wealthier, more consumerist, and more cynical. The audience saw themselves in Jia, the desire for a better life, the obsession with Western luxury, and the underlying anxiety about security. With this victory, Tang Wei achieved something rare in the history of entertainment, a full rehabilitation without a single apology. She never apologized for lust caution. She never denounced Ang Lee. She simply outworked the controversy. She proved that talent is a renewable resource. But amidst the glitz of premieres and the ring of the cash registers, Tang Wei remained remarkably detached. In interviews from this period, there is a sense of distance. She smiles, she jokes, she promotes the film, but the eyes are watchful. She had learned the hard lesson that public adoration is fickle. The same millions who were now calling her goddess were the same millions who had watched silently as she was erased 5 years earlier. She bought a piece of land in a remote part of South Korea. She continued to live quietly. She did not move back to the epicenter of the Beijing social scene. She kept 1 foot in the industry and 1 foot firmly outside of it. The Jia character was loud, but Tang Wei was becoming even quieter. The success of Finding Mr. Right also marked the completion of her Seattle duology. 2 films, shot in the same foreign city, representing the 2 poles of her survival. Late autumn was the winter of her exile, cold, sad, artistic. Finding Mr. Right was the spring of her return, warm, commercial, triumphant. Together they formed the bridge that carried her over the abyss. As 2013 drew to a close, Tang Wei was no longer a project for directors to save. She was a titan. She had conquered the art house and the box office. She had conquered China and Korea. She was 34 years old, and she was free. But true freedom allows for the most dangerous choice of all, the choice to follow the heart, even if it leads away from the safety she had fought so hard to secure. While the world was focused on her on-screen romances, a real-life romance was blooming in the shadows. It was a connection that had begun in the fog of late autumn and had survived the distance and the scrutiny. It was a love story that would cross borders, languages, and cultures. And just like her career, it would come as a surprise to everyone. The actress who had been defined by men, by Ang Lee, by the censors, by her fictional lovers, was about to make a decision that was entirely her own. She was about to choose a partner who saw the woman behind the mask. But Tang Wei had stopped reading from the standard script years ago. While the tabloids in Beijing and Hong Kong were busy speculating about which real estate mogul or tech billionaire she might be dating, Tang Wei was quietly booking a flight to a remote, windswept island in the Baltic Sea. She was not going there for a fashion shoot, nor for a luxury vacation. She was going there to make a pilgrimage and to make a vow that would once again baffle the public. In July 2014, the news broke like a thunderclap across the Chinese and Korean entertainment worlds. Tang Wei was getting married. But the groom was not a financier. He was not a famous actor with millions of fans. He was Kim Tae-yong, the bespectacled, soft-spoken, and intellectually rigorous director of Late Autumn. He was 10 years her senior, a divorced man and a foreigner. The man who had guided her through the fog of Seattle 4 years prior, who had directed her in the film that saved her career, had become the man who would walk with her through life. The romance had been a slow subterranean burn. After filming Late Autumn in 2010, they had remained friends, communicating sporadically across the distance between Beijing and Seoul. It wasn't until late 2013, when Tang Wei traveled to Korea for a commercial shoot, that the friendship deepened into something undeniable. The cultural barriers were significant. She was Chinese, he was Korean. Neither spoke the other's language fluently, forcing them to communicate in their shared, imperfect English. But they shared a language that transcended grammar and vocabulary, the language of cinema and the language of solitude. They were both outsiders in their own way. He, an introspective auteur in a commercial industry; she, a star who preferred the shadows to the spotlight. Their wedding ceremony was a master class in defiance of modern celebrity culture. There was no grand banquet in a Beijing hotel ballroom with hundreds of tables. There were no corporate sponsors. There was no live stream. Instead, they traveled to Faro, a desolate island off the coast of Sweden. To the average person, this location meant nothing. But to a cinephile like Tang Wei, it was sacred ground. Faro was the home and final resting place of the legendary Swedish director Ingmar Bergman. Bergman was the master of existential angst, of deep psychological probing, of the silence of God, the very artistic lineage she aspired to. In a small, improvised ceremony in front of Bergman's home, with only a few witnesses and the sound of the Baltic waves crashing against the limestone stacks, Tang Wei and Kim Tae-yong exchanged vows. They celebrated by singing a song together and eating a simple meal. It was an act of pure intimacy, a declaration that their union belonged to art, not to commerce. The public reaction in China was a complex cocktail of shock, nationalism, and eventual grudging respect. Initially, there was confusion. Netizens asked why their national goddess was marrying a mediocre foreign director. Comments flooded Weibo questioning the choice. Why him? He is so ordinary. Our goddess is marrying a Korean. In a culture often obsessed with matching doors and windows, the idiom for marrying within one's social and economic class, her choice was seen as radically confusing. She could have had anyone. She chose a man who offered her nothing but understanding. But as the details of the wedding emerged, the simplicity, the artistic location, the lack of pretension, the narrative shifted. People realized that Tang Wei was not seeking status. She was seeking a soulmate. She was marrying the man who had seen her when she was invisible, the man who had respected her talent when others saw only scandal. It was, in its own way, the ultimate happy ending to her years of exile. However, domestic bliss did not mean professional retirement. Even as she settled into her new life as a wife, dividing her time between Beijing and Seoul, Tang Wei was preparing to dive into perhaps the most grueling role of her career since Lust, Caution. She was done with the light-hearted comedy of finding Mr. Right. She wanted to bleed again. She wanted to prove that the box office success hadn't softened her. The project was The Golden Era, a 3-hour biographical epic directed by the acclaimed Hong Kong filmmaker An Hui. The subject was Xiao Hong, one of the most brilliant and tragic writers of 20th century China. Xiao Hong's life was a catalog of suffering. She ran away from an arranged marriage in the 1930s, survived freezing poverty in Harbin, endured abusive relationships with men who envied her talent, lost children, and eventually died of tuberculosis in Hong Kong at the age of 31, all while the Second Sino-Japanese War raged around her. Xiao Hong was a woman who lived with the sky as her roof and the earth as her bed. She was a wanderer, an exile, a woman who wrote to survive. The parallels with Tang Wei were impossible to ignore. Both were women of immense talent who had been chewed up by the patriarchal societies they lived in. Both had experienced exile. Both refused to compromise their integrity for comfort. Tang Wei felt a spiritual kinship with the writer. She didn't just want to play her, she wanted to channel her. To become Xiao Hong, Tang Wei returned to the method intensity that Ang Lee had instilled in her a decade prior. She decided that she could not play a starving writer on a full stomach. She began to restrict her diet, losing weight until her cheekbones were sharp enough to cut glass. But the physical transformation was only the beginning. The film was shot on location in Harbin and other parts of northern China during the brutal depths of winter. Temperatures on set regularly dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Most actors would rely on heat pads, warm trailers, and layers of thermal underwear. Tang Wei refused. She wanted to feel the cold in her bones just as Xiao Hong had. She wore thin cotton cheongsams in the snow. She stood in the freezing wind until her lips turned blue, and her uncontrollably shivering body made it difficult to speak her lines. Director An Hui later said, Tang Wei didn't just act, she merged. There is a specific scene in the film where Xiao Hong, pregnant, abandoned, and destitute, is eating a piece of stale bread in a freezing room. Tang Wei eats it with a voracious, animalistic hunger that is terrifying to watch. It wasn't acting. She was hungry. She was cold. She was channeling the ghosts of 1930s China. She spent hours copying Xiao Hong's handwriting, immersing herself in the writer's despair. She deliberately isolated herself from the cast, maintaining a mood of melancholic detachment. She was punishing herself, perhaps trying to exorcise the last remnants of the commercial star she had become. She wanted to suffer for her art because she believed that suffering was the only path to truth. The Golden Era was selected as the closing film of the Venice Film Festival in September 2014, a poetic return to the place where her career had both launched and crashed 7 years prior. Standing on the red carpet in Venice, 7 years older, married and established, Tang Wei looked like a survivor. But the reception to the film was complicated. The Golden Era was not a standard biopic. It was experimental, breaking the fourth wall, jumping through time, and featuring characters speaking directly to the camera in documentary-style interviews. It was intellectual, difficult, and demanding. Commercially, it was a failure. The audience that had flocked to see the rom-com Tang Wei and Finding Mr. Right found the Golden Era tedious, depressing, and too long. They wanted the national sweetheart, not the starving intellectual. But for Tang Wei, the box office numbers were irrelevant. This film was a statement of intent. It solidified her status not just as a star, but as a serious artist who was willing to risk her commercial viability for a project with historical weight. She was telling the industry, I can make you money, but I will not be owned by you. Following this heavy historical drama, Tang Wei made a pivot that surprised everyone. She went to Hollywood. In 2015, the legendary director Michael Mann, the mastermind behind Heat and The Last of the Mohicans, cast her in Black Hat, a high-tech cyber thriller starring Chris Hemsworth. On paper, it was her big break in the West. It was the moment she would cross over from Asian star to global icon. She played Chen Lin, a high-level network engineer who teams up with Hemsworth's hacker character to stop a global cyber terrorist. Tang Wei approached the role with her usual diligence, studying computer coding and working on her English intonation. But the reality of the production was a harsh lesson in how Hollywood views Asian actresses. Despite Michael Mann's best intentions to create a strong female lead, the script ultimately failed her. Tang Wei was often relegated to the role of the love interest, while spending her boyfriend's illicit money on luxury handbags. On paper, the character was a disaster waiting to happen. In a society grappling with the wealth gap and corruption, playing a materialistic mistress could have easily reignited the public's animosity toward her. It danced dangerously close to the very accusations of moral corruption that had gotten her banned in the first place. But Tang Wei saw something else in the script. She saw a redemption arc, and she saw the guiding hand of a female director, Zhui Xiaolu. Director Zhui Xiaolu was not interested in vilifying the mistress. She was interested in humanizing her. She wanted to explore the emptiness of materialism and the journey toward independence. Tang Wei accepted the role, and in doing so she returned to Seattle, the city that had sheltered her during her exile in late autumn. But this was a different Seattle. If late autumn was the Seattle of fog and ghosts, Finding Mr. Right was the Seattle of sunlight, space needles, and screwball comedy. The transformation was startling. Tang Wei, known for her reserve and her intellectual aura, exploded onto the screen as a brash, loud, shopaholic diva. She wore garish designer clothes, screamed at drivers, threw credit cards around, and spoke with a rapid-fire Beijing attitude. It was a performance of high energy and charisma. For the first act of the film, she is insufferable. But as the story progresses and her tycoon boyfriend is arrested back in China, stripping her of her wealth, Tang Wei peels back the layers. She shows the terror of a woman who has relied on men for everything and is suddenly alone in a foreign land. Her chemistry with the male lead, Wu Shubo, was electric. It was the classic odd couple dynamic. But it was Tang Wei's comedic timing that shocked the critics. She was funny, she was warm, she was lovable. She took a character that should have been hated, a gold digger, and turned her into a symbol of resilience. The audience watched her scrub toilets, sell bags on the street, and eventually find her own strength. When Finding Mr. Right was released in March 2013, the reaction was seismic. It didn't just perform well, it shattered records. It became one of the highest-grossing domestic romantic comedies in Chinese history, taking in over 500 million yuan. It beat Hollywood blockbusters. It became a cultural touchstone. The success of Finding Mr. Right was the final nail in the coffin of the ban. You cannot ban a woman who generates 500 million yuan at the box office. Money, in the end, is the most powerful censor. The industry that had shunned her now rushed to embrace her. The advertisers who had torn up her contracts came crawling back. But this time, they weren't buying the controversial Tang Wei. They were buying the national sweetheart. The irony was profound. Tang Wei had been banned for playing a woman who uses sex to serve her country, but she was redeemed by playing a woman who uses money to serve herself. It said as much about the changing values of modern China as it did about her acting. The China of 2013 was a different beast than the China of 2007. It was wealthier, more consumerist, and more cynical. The audience saw themselves in Jia Jia, the desire for a better life, the obsession with Western luxury, and the underlying anxiety about security. With this victory, Tang Wei achieved something rare in the history of entertainment, a full rehabilitation without a single apology. She never apologized for lust caution. She never denounced Ang Lee. She simply outworked the controversy. She proved that talent is a renewable resource. But amidst the glitz of premieres and the ring of the cash registers, Tang Wei remained remarkably detached. In interviews from this period, there is a sense of distance. She smiles, she jokes, she promotes the film, but the eyes are watchful. She had learned the hard lesson that public adoration is fickle. The same millions who were now calling her goddess were the same millions who had watched silently as she was erased 5 years earlier. She bought a piece of land in a remote part of South Korea. She continued to live quietly. She did not move back to the epicenter of the Beijing social scene. She kept one foot in the industry and one foot firmly outside of it. The Jia Jia character was loud, but Tang Wei was becoming even quieter. The success of Finding Mr. Right also marked the completion of her Seattle duology. 2 films, shot in the same foreign city, representing the 2 poles of her survival. Late autumn was the winter of her exile, cold, sad, artistic. Finding Mr. Right was the spring of her return, warm, commercial, triumphant. Together they formed the bridge that carried her over the abyss. As 2013 drew to a close, Tang Wei was no longer a project for directors to save. She was a titan. She had conquered the art house and the box office. She had conquered China and Korea. She was 34 years old, and she was free. But true freedom allows for the most dangerous choice of all, the choice to follow the heart, even if it leads away from the safety she had fought so hard to secure. While the world was focused on her on-screen romances, a real-life romance was blooming in the shadows. It was a connection that had begun in the fog of late autumn and had survived the distance and the scrutiny. It was a love story that would cross borders, languages, and cultures. And just like her career, it would come as a surprise to everyone. The actress who had been defined by men, by Ang Lee, by the censors, by her fictional lovers, was about to make a decision that was entirely her own. She was about to choose a partner who saw the woman behind the mask. But Tang Wei had stopped reading from the standard script years ago. While the tabloids in Beijing and Hong Kong were busy speculating about which real estate mogul or tech billionaire she might be dating, Tang Wei was quietly booking a flight to a remote, windswept island in the Baltic Sea. She was not going there for a fashion shoot, nor for a luxury vacation. She was going there to make a pilgrimage and to make a vow that would once again baffle the public. In July 2014, the news broke like a thunderclap across the Chinese and Korean entertainment worlds. Tang Wei was getting married. But the groom was not a financier. He was not a famous actor with millions of fans. He was Kim Tae-yong, the bespectacled, soft-spoken, and intellectually rigorous director of Late Autumn. He was 10 years her senior, a divorced man and a foreigner. The man who had guided her through the fog of Seattle 4 years prior, who had directed her in the film that saved her career, had become the man who would walk with her through life. The romance had been a slow subterranean burn. After filming Late Autumn in 2010, they had remained friends, communicating sporadically across the distance between Beijing and Seoul. It wasn't until late 2013, when Tang Wei traveled to Korea for a commercial shoot, that the friendship deepened into something undeniable. The cultural barriers were significant. She was Chinese, he was Korean. Neither spoke the other's language fluently, forcing them to communicate in their shared, imperfect English. But they shared a language that transcended grammar and vocabulary, the language of cinema and the language of solitude. They were both outsiders in their own way. He, an introspective auteur in a commercial industry; she, a star who preferred the shadows to the spotlight. Their wedding ceremony was a masterclass in defiance of modern celebrity culture. There was no grand banquet in a Beijing hotel ballroom with hundreds of tables. There were no corporate sponsors. There was no live stream. Instead, they traveled to Faro, a desolate island off the coast of Sweden. To the average person, this location meant nothing. But to a cinephile like Tang Wei, it was sacred ground. Faro was the home and final resting place of the legendary Swedish director Ingmar Bergman. Bergman was the master of existential angst, of deep psychological probing, of the silence of God, the very artistic lineage she aspired to. In a small, improvised ceremony in front of Bergman's home, with only a few witnesses and the sound of the Baltic waves crashing against the limestone stacks, Tang Wei and Kim Tae-yong exchanged vows. They celebrated by singing a song together and eating a simple meal. It was an act of pure intimacy, a declaration that their union belonged to art, not to commerce. The public reaction in China was a complex cocktail of shock, nationalism, and eventual grudging respect. Initially, there was confusion. Netizens asked why their national goddess was marrying a mediocre foreign director. Comments flooded Weibo questioning the choice. Why him? He is so ordinary. Our goddess is marrying a Korean. In a culture often obsessed with matching doors and windows, the idiom for marrying within one's social and economic class, her choice was seen as radically confusing. She could have had anyone. She chose a man who offered her nothing but understanding. But as the details of the wedding emerged, the simplicity, the artistic location, the lack of pretension, the narrative shifted. People realized that Tang Wei was not seeking status. She was seeking a soulmate. She was marrying the man who had seen her when she was invisible, the man who had respected her talent when others saw only scandal. It was, in its own way, the ultimate happy ending to her years of exile. However, domestic bliss did not mean professional retirement. Even as she settled into her new life as a wife, dividing her time between Beijing and Seoul, Tang Wei was preparing to dive into perhaps the most grueling role of her career since Lust, Caution. She was done with the light-hearted comedy of finding Mr. Right. She wanted to bleed again. She wanted to prove that the box office success hadn't softened her. The project was The Golden Era, a 3-hour biographical epic directed by the acclaimed Hong Kong filmmaker An Hui. The subject was Xiao Hong, one of the most brilliant and tragic writers of 20th century China. Xiao Hong's life was a catalog of suffering. She ran away from an arranged marriage in the 1930s, survived freezing poverty in Harbin, endured abusive relationships with men who envied her talent, lost children, and eventually died of tuberculosis in Hong Kong at the age of 31, all while the Second Sino-Japanese War raged around her. Xiao Hong was a woman who lived with the sky as her roof and the earth as her bed. She was a wanderer, an exile, a woman who wrote to survive. The parallels with Tang Wei were impossible to ignore. Both were women of immense talent who had been chewed up by the patriarchal societies they lived in. Both had experienced exile. Both refused to compromise their integrity for comfort. Tang Wei felt a spiritual kinship with the writer. She didn't just want to play her, she wanted to channel her. To become Xiao Hong, Tang Wei returned to the method intensity that Ang Lee had instilled in her a decade prior. She decided that she could not play a starving writer on a full stomach. She began to restrict her diet, losing weight until her cheekbones were sharp enough to cut glass. But the physical transformation was only the beginning. The film was shot on location in Harbin and other parts of northern China during the brutal depths of winter. Temperatures on set regularly dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Most actors would rely on heat pads, warm trailers, and layers of thermal underwear. Tang Wei refused. She wanted to feel the cold in her bones just as Xiao Hong had. She wore thin cotton cheongsams in the snow. She stood in the freezing wind, until her lips turned blue, and her uncontrollably shivering body made it difficult to speak her lines. Director Anne Hui later said, Tang Wei didn't just act, she merged. There is a specific scene in the film where Xiao Hong, pregnant, abandoned, and destitute, is eating a piece of stale bread in a freezing room. Tang Wei eats it with a voracious, animalistic hunger that is terrifying to watch. It wasn't acting. She was hungry. She was cold. She was channeling the ghosts of 1930s China. She spent hours copying Xiao Hong's handwriting, immersing herself in the writer's despair. She deliberately isolated herself from the cast, maintaining a mood of melancholic detachment. She was punishing herself, perhaps trying to exorcise the last remnants of the commercial star she had become. She wanted to suffer for her art because she believed that suffering was the only path to truth. The Golden Era was selected as the closing film of the Venice Film Festival in September 2014, a poetic return to the place where her career had both launched and crashed 7 years prior. Standing on the red carpet in Venice, 7 years older, married and established, Tang Wei looked like a survivor. But the reception to the film was complicated. The Golden Era was not a standard biopic. It was experimental, breaking the fourth wall, jumping through time, and featuring characters speaking directly to the camera in documentary-style interviews. It was intellectual, difficult, and demanding. Commercially, it was a failure. The audience that had flocked to see the rom-com Tang Wei and Finding Mr. Right found the Golden Era tedious, depressing, and too long. They wanted the national sweetheart, not the starving intellectual. But for Tang Wei, the box office numbers were irrelevant. This film was a statement of intent. It solidified her status not just as a star, but as a serious artist who was willing to risk her commercial viability for a project with historical weight. She was telling the industry, I can make you money, but I will not be owned by you. Following this heavy historical drama, Tang Wei made a pivot that surprised everyone. She went to Hollywood. In 2015, the legendary director Michael Mann, the mastermind behind Heat and The Last of the Mohicans, cast her in Black Hat, a high-tech cyber thriller starring Chris Hemsworth. On paper, it was her big break in the West. It was the moment she would cross over from Asian star to global icon. She played Chen Lin, a high-level network engineer who teams up with Hemsworth's hacker character to stop a global cyber terrorist. Tang Wei approached the role with her usual diligence, studying computer coding and working on her English intonation. But the reality of the production was a harsh lesson in how Hollywood views Asian actresses. Despite Michael Mann's best intentions to create a strong female lead, the script ultimately failed her. Tang Wei was often relegated to the role of the love interest, the exotic beauty standing in the background of action sequences, or the emotional anchor for the white male protagonist. When Black Hat was released in early 2015, it was a critical and commercial bomb. Critics savaged the plot and the lack of chemistry between the leads. Tang Wei's performance was praised for its dignity and intelligence, but she was fighting a losing battle against a weak script and a film that didn't know what to do with her. The experience was a clarifying moment. It showed her the limitations of the Western industry. In Hollywood, she would always be the Asian actress, fighting for scraps of screen time in action movies. In Asia, she was Tang Wei, a force of nature, a woman who could carry a 3-hour epic on her shoulders. It reinforced her commitment to Asian cinema, where the stories were deeper, the roles more complex, and the cultural resonance stronger. By 2016, Tang Wei had been running a marathon for nearly a decade. From the boot camp of Lust, Caution to the Exile in London, from the fog of Seattle to the snows of Manchuria, and finally to the sets of Hollywood. She had never stopped moving. She had fought for her survival, fought for her reputation, and fought for her art. She was 37 years old, and she was tired. Now she decided to stop fighting and start living. In early 2016, she announced that she was pregnant. For the first time in her adult life, she stepped away from the camera entirely. She retreated to the countryside, splitting her time between a quiet home in Korea and her family in China. She spent time in Foro. She shielded her private life with a ferocity that the paparazzi had learned to respect. This hiatus was not an exile. It was a sanctuary. She gave birth to a daughter, Summer, in August 2016. The goddess was now a mother. In the few interviews she gave during this period, the change in her demeanor was palpable. The sharp, nervous energy of her youth, the energy of a woman constantly trying to prove she deserved to exist, had been replaced by a grounded calmness. She spoke about growing vegetables, about the sound of the wind, about the simple joy of watching a child learn to walk. She mentioned that for the first time, she felt rooted. While Tang Wei was changing diapers and reading books in the countryside, the world she left behind was mutating. The Chinese entertainment industry of 2016 to 2019 was entering the era of traffic stars. Algorithms were replacing directors. Casting was determined by social media engagement numbers rather than acting ability. The nuanced, difficult cinema that Tang Wei excelled in was being squeezed out by CGI spectacles, idle dramas, and quick consumption content designed for mobile phones. Critics began to whisper again, has she retired? Is she finished? Can a woman approaching 40, who refuses to do reality TV, who refuses to live stream, who has no social media presence, survive in this new ecosystem? The industry moves at the speed of light. 3 years away is an eternity. A generation of young viewers had grown up who only knew her name as a legend, not as a living presence. They knew her as the woman from the scandal or the woman from the rom-com, but they didn't know her power. But Tang Wei was unbothered by the noise. She knew something the critics didn't. She knew that true artistry isn't about being constantly visible. It's about waiting for the right moment to strike. She was waiting for a script that demanded her specific frequency of pain and beauty. She was waiting for a challenge that would scare her again. She was done with trying to fit into the molds of rom-com queen or Hollywood action star. She was ready for something darker. And in 2019, the call came. It didn't come from Beijing. It didn't come from Hollywood. It came from Seoul again. But this was not just another romantic drama. This was a summons from the dark wizard of Korean cinema, Park Chan-wook. Park, the mastermind behind Oldboy and The Handmaiden, was writing a new film. He was crafting a detective story, a noir soaked in blood, obsession, and mist. He had a character in his mind, a woman who was mysterious, dangerous, broken, and impossibly alluring. A woman who could be a murderer or a victim depending on how the light hit her face. A woman who spoke in a way that made you lean in to listen. He didn't hold auditions. He didn't look at lists of traffic stars. He later told the press, "I wrote this script for Tang Wei. If she had said no, I would not have made the movie." Park saw in her something that couldn't be taught in acting school, a dignified elegance within a storm. He needed a protagonist who was a foreigner in every sense, linguistically, culturally, and emotionally. He needed Tang Wei. Accepting the role of Song Seo-rae was not a simple yes for Tang Wei. It was a commitment to a new kind of artistic torture. If Ang Lee had broken her body in the boot camps of Shanghai, Park Chan-wook was about to break her mind. The character of Seo-rae is a Chinese immigrant living in Korea, working as a caregiver for the elderly. She speaks Korean, but it is a strange, bookish Korean, the kind learned from reading classical literature and watching historical dramas. She uses words that no modern Korean uses, giving her an air of timelessness, of being perpetually out of step with the reality around her. For Tang Wei, this meant she couldn't just learn her lines phonetically. She had to understand the grammatical architecture of a language she didn't speak fluently. She had to act in a language where the verb comes at the end of the sentence, meaning the emotion of the line is suspended until the very last syllable. She hired private tutors and spent months in a language lab recording every line of the script, listening to the intonation thousands of times, stripping away her Chinese accent to replace it with the specific, uncanny accent of Xiao Rei. It was a linguistic high-wire act performed without a net, a challenge that required a total rewiring of her expressive instincts. Filming began in the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic in October 2020. The world was locked down, fearful and isolated. This atmosphere of distance seeped into the celluloid. Decision to Leave is a romance, but it is a romance where the lovers almost never touch. It is a love story told through text messages, voice recordings, and the glass mirrors of a police interrogation room. Tang Wei plays Xiao Rei, a woman whose husband has died in a suspicious rock climbing accident. Park Hae-il plays Hae-jun, the insomniac detective investigating the case. He suspects her, he stalks her, and in the process he falls in love with her. The brilliance of Tang Wei's performance lies in its ambiguity. Is she a grieving widow? Is she a cold-blooded killer? Is she a victim of abuse finding liberation? For the first hour of the film, the audience cannot tell. Tang Wei calibrates her performance with the precision of a safecracker. A slight twitch of the lip, a flicker of the eyes. She invites the detective and the audience to project their own fantasies onto her. She becomes the mist that permeates the film's setting, intangible, shifting, and impossible to hold. One of the most defining elements of the film is the use of translation apps. In key moments of emotional intensity, when her Korean fails her, Xiao Rei speaks Mandarin into her phone, and a robotic voice translates it for the detective. This device could have been comical in lesser hands. With Tang Wei, it became heartbreaking. There is a pivotal scene where she confesses her true feelings. She speaks in Chinese, her voice thick with passion, pain, and a desperate need to be understood. Then we wait. The machine processes the data. The robotic voice speaks the translation in a flat, monotone drone. The contrast between the heat of her delivery and the coldness of the translation highlights the tragedy of her life. She is a woman who can never be fully understood. She is always mediated, always translated, always one step removed from true connection. This role was a meta-commentary on Tang Wei's own existence. For 15 years, she had been translated by the media. The Chinese state labeled her a threat. The Western media labeled her a victim. The Korean media labeled her a goddess. Everyone had a version of Tang Wei, but who was the real woman behind the subtitles? In Decision to Leave, she finally weaponized this confusion. She used her foreignness not as a liability, but as a source of power. Fast forward to May 2022. The Cannes Film Festival, the most prestigious cinema event on the planet, beckoned. Tang Wei returned to the Croisette 15 years after Lust Caution. But the dynamic had shifted profoundly. In 2007, she was the terrified rookie clinging to Ang Lee's arm, unsure of her place in the world. In 2022, she was the veteran. She walked the red carpet with a relaxed, almost regal confidence, wearing a dress that plunged low, elegant, and daring. She looked like a queen returning to claim her throne. The premiere of Decision to Leave was a sensation. When the credits rolled at the Grand Théâtre Lumière, The audience stood for a rapturous ovation. Critics were scrambling for superlatives. The Guardian gave it 5 stars. Variety called her mesmerizing. They compared her to the great Hitchcock blondes, to Kim Novak in Vertigo, to Ingrid Bergman. But she was better than that. She wasn't just the object of the mystery. She was the mystery. Tang Wei did not win the Best Actress award at Cannes that year. It went to Zara Mir Ibrahimi. But Park Chan-wook won Best Director. And in his acceptance speech and in every interview that followed, he made one thing clear. This film is Tang Wei. Without her, it does not exist. If Cannes was the coronation, the Korean award season was the victory lap. What happened in late 2022 and early 2023 in South Korea is unprecedented in the history of Asian entertainment. Tang Wei, a Chinese citizen, a foreigner, completely swept the board. She won Best Actress at the Chunsa Film Art Awards. She won Best Actress at the Bill Film Awards. She won Best Actress at the Korean Association of Film Critics Awards. She won Best Actress at the Grand Bell Awards. But the crowning glory was the 43rd Blue Dragon Film Awards. The Blue Dragons are the Oscars of Korea, notoriously difficult for foreigners to penetrate. When Tang Wei's name was announced, the reaction was not just polite applause, it was adoration. She became the first non-Korean actress in history to win the award. In her acceptance speech, she held the trophy and said simply, "I would like to thank the director for taking me out of the mist." It was a line that referenced the film, but it resonated with everyone who knew her story. She had spent a decade in the mist of the ban, the mist of exile, the mist of misunderstanding. And now, finally, she was standing in the clear light of day. Back in China, the reaction to her triumph was a fascinating sociological phenomenon. Decision to Leave was not released in Chinese theaters. The content, a dark romance involving murder and police corruption, was unlikely to pass the censors without cuts. And perhaps Tang Wei simply didn't want to subject her work to the butcher's knife again. But the film was watched. Millions downloaded it. It became the most talked about movie of the year on Chinese social media. The sentiment among the Chinese public was a mix of intense pride and bitter regret. Netizens hailed her as the light of Chinese cinema. They contrasted her global success with the stagnant state of the domestic industry, which was churning out patriotic blockbusters and shallow idol dramas. Comments on Weibo read, "She had to leave China to become a legend. We banned her, and she became a queen." Tang Wei belongs to the world now, not us. The Kill Order of 2008 had achieved the exact opposite of its intent. It hadn't destroyed her, it had freed her. It had pushed her out of a pond and into the ocean. The success of Decision to Leave completed a trilogy of roles that defined her exile. In late autumn, she was the prisoner, Anna, trapped, silent, waiting for release. In Finding Mr. Right, she was the survivor, Jia, scrapping for dignity in a foreign land. In Decision to Leave, she was the master, Ray, a woman who controls the narrative, who decides when to love and when to leave. She had evolved from victim to survivor to architect. She had proven that an actress does not need a scandal to be interesting, nor does she need a motherland to be successful. She had built a career on the very fault lines that were supposed to swallow her. The tension between China and the West, between China and Korea, between the past and the present. By 2023, Tang Wei had achieved a status that transcends star. She is a great actor. In an industry that treats women like disposable commodities, consuming their youth and spitting out the rind, Tang Wei has aged like fine wine. She carries the weight of her history in her eyes, and that weight gives her gravity. But the most poignant part of this victory is not the trophies or the reviews. It is the vindication of a choice she made 15 years ago. When the ban fell, when the world turned dark, she chose not to fight with noise, but to fight with excellence. She chose to study. She chose to learn new languages. She chose to wait. The kill order is now a historical footnote, a shameful memory of a rigid system. Tang Wei is the headline. The erasure failed. The ghost came back to life. As the waves of acclaim wash over her, Tang Wei stands on a shore that she built herself. She is no longer looking for permission to exist. She is no longer looking for a Mr. Right or a savior director. She has become her own savior. But every story has an ending, and every journey must eventually circle back to its beginning. Tang Wei has conquered the world, but there is one question that remains, one ghost that perhaps still lingers in the quiet moments between the applause. What was the cost? What did she lose in the fire that forged her? And as she looks toward the horizon of her 50s, what is the final lesson of the girl from Hangzhou who dared to play with fire? The stage is set for the final reflection. The lights are dimming. The audience is silent. The actress is ready to take her final bow. In the frantic, neon-lit ecosystem of modern entertainment, silence is usually synonymous with death. For a celebrity in the 21st century, existence is defined by noise. The daily Instagram post, the live-streamed apology, the carefully curated scandal, the relentless algorithmic engagement. To disappear, even for a month, is to risk obsolescence. Yet, here is Tang Wei. She has no Weibo account. She has no Instagram. She does not do reality television. She does not live stream to sell lipstick. In an industry that demands constant accessibility, she has built a fortress of unavailability. And miraculously, instead of fading away, her star has only burned brighter. This is the final paradox of her life. The Chinese state tried to silence her by force in 2008. They erased her from the airwaves, hoping to render her invisible. But in doing so, they inadvertently taught her the power of invisibility. They taught her that if you do not give the world your words, they cannot twist them. If you do not give them your image, they cannot commodify it. By trying to destroy her, the censors gave her the greatest gift an artist can possess, the freedom to be unknown. Tang Wei's survival is a statistical anomaly in the current market. The Chinese entertainment industry has mutated into a system governed by traffic. Today, casting decisions are rarely artistic choices. They are algorithmic calculations based on social media engagement and e-commerce conversion rates. In this metrics-obsessed ecosystem, actors are treated as depreciating assets rather than artists. Had Tang Wei not been banned, had she stayed in the safe lane after lust, caution, she might have become one of them. She might have been forced into the golden cage of state-approved blockbusters, playing safe, patriotic roles, smiling for the cameras while her soul withered. The ban, brutal as it was, severed that timeline. It forced her off the highway and into the wilderness. In the wilderness, she didn't just survive, she evolved. She learned English in London. She learned Cantonese in Hong Kong. She learned Korean in Seoul. She became a pan-Asian entity, a citizen of cinema rather than a subject of a specific regime. While her contemporaries were fighting for screen time on Chinese variety shows, Tang Wei was walking the beaches of Foro, communing with the spirit of Ingmar Bergman. While they were chasing trends, she was chasing truth. But let us not romanticize the trauma. The cost was high. We must return to the original sin, the injustice of 2008. The question that has haunted this narrative is, why her? Why was the woman punished while the men were celebrated? History has provided a grim answer. Tang Wei was punished because she was the vessel of the transgression. In the eyes of the patriarchy, Ang Lee was the genius architect, and Tony Leung was the masterful operator, but Tang Wei was the body. She was the site where the shame occurred. By stripping herself bare, physically and emotionally, she challenged the rigid moral purity that the state wished to project. She was the sacrificial lamb slaughtered to appease the conservative gods. However, the passage of time has delivered a verdict that no censor could have predicted. Today, Tony Leung is still revered, yes. Ang Lee is still a legend, yes. But Tang Wei, she is something else. She is a symbol of resilience that resonates specifically with women across East Asia. Her story is no longer a cautionary tale about indecency. It is an inspirational epic about endurance. She represents the woman who was told to sit down and shut up, who instead stood up and walked away, all the way to the top of the world. Look at these two images. On the left, Wang Chia-chi, the girl who uses her body as a weapon and dies for it. On the right, Song Seo-rei, the woman who uses her mind as a weapon and survives. The journey from the left image to the right is the story of a woman reclaiming her agency. In lust, caution, she was the object of the gaze. Ang Lee's gaze, Tony Leung's gaze, the audience's gaze. In decision to leave, she controls the gaze. She decides what you see. She decides when to leave. It is not a coincidence that her greatest role since her debut is titled Decision to Leave. It is the autobiography of her soul. She decided to leave the toxicity of the gossip columns. She decided to leave the expectations of her country. She decided to leave the role of the victim. Today, Tang Wei lives a life that defies the logic of celebrity. She is known to disappear for months at a time. She plants her own vegetables. She rides the subway. She wears comfortable shoes. She does not care if you think she is glamorous. She has seen the emptiness of glamour, and she has chosen the substance of earth. There is a profound lesson here for all of us. Living in an age of surveillance and cancel culture, Tang Wei teaches us that when the world tries to define you, the most radical thing you can do is refuse the definition. When they scream at you, do not scream back. Silence is louder. Excellence is undeniable. She is the bamboo that bent under the hurricane of 2008, but did not break. The storm passed. The winds died down. The politicians who banned her have likely retired or been purged themselves in the endless shifting of gears in Beijing. The Fenqing who burned her posters have grown up and moved on, but the bamboo remains. It stands tall, rooted in new soil, its leaves rustling in a wind of its own making. Decades from now, when the history of Chinese cinema is written, the scandal of lust, caution, will be a footnote. The kill order will be analyzed by historians as a moment of administrative madness, but the name Tang Wei will stand alone. She will not be remembered as the actress who was banned. She will be remembered as the actress who refused to be erased. She is the forbidden star who navigated the dark night of the soul and waited for the dawn. And when the sun finally rose, it didn't rise in the east or the west. It rose from within her. She is Tang Wei, and she is still here.